Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to our channel and thanks for logging on. If you enjoy these videos, do me a favor and subscribe right here on YouTube to Watchbox Reviews. I would really appreciate it. And then I'd be able to send videos of watches like this to your inbox as soon as tomorrow morning, every morning. If you like this watch, you can buy it on our website, thewatchbox.com. Buy, trade, and sell luxury watches globally in 24 hours a day on thewatchbox.com. This is part of the most discussed new model family of 2018, the Breitling Navitimer 8. I was at the unveil in February of 2018, this year, for the entire model line with Georges Kern and Breitling product director Guy Beauvais, and I feel as though I've got a bit of a kinship with this watch because I helped to influence its final design. Now, I did a little bit of a stream of consciousness spiel with the entire model line in front of Mr. Beauvais, and he went from kind of quizzically puzzled to vaguely impressed and asked me if I had any input on the line, and I said, well, I think the gold version should have applied numerals rather than printed. And he said, you know what, a lot of us were thinking the same thing. And sure enough, here's the production version with gold applied numerals. You can send the check to tmosso at Watchbox 166 East Levering Mill, Bala, Kenwood, Pennsylvania. Okay, that said, 43 millimeters across the round of the case, not including pump pushers and crown. The watch is not as thick as you might expect, nor is it thin. 14.5 millimeters. I would say because the bezel is somewhat tapered inward rather than flared outward, it will wear a little bit thinner relative to the encumbrance of a cuff than you would find on a calculator bezel Navitimer. Lug to lug, this is where the new model line really asserts some of its change philosophy, as it's only 50.8 millimeters lug to lug, so though it's a 43, 50.8 is quite compact for that case size. And you'll also note that, true to their word from Mr. Beauvais and Kern, the lugs are shorter, stubbier, and more dramatically tapered downward to more easily fit smaller wrists. The elephantitis that's afflicted Breitling for a couple of generations now is gently being scaled back. Now, the case is substantial, there's no doubt about that. A rare display case back on a Breitling. Nevertheless, it doesn't diminish the mass that much. You still know you're wearing a solid hunk of gold. The timepiece does feature broad stance on the wrist. As you can see, it features a 23 millimeter lug spacing, which feels more modern than many of the legacy Breitlings that are still in the collection. It's simply a broader stance that makes for a better match aesthetically strap to case size. The strap itself is classical Breitling with an upscale touch, as the standard aviator's calfskin with a contrasting stitch has been swapped out for medium rectangular scale alligator leather, and it is a light brown semi-gloss. You'll note that it does have a very thin folded edge. You can see the layers of the strap composed and bonded together. On the underside, supple calfskin, and then you can see the buckle has been styled for this collection specifically, as the polished bevel nicely matches the polished bevel of the lug itself, so design symmetry much appreciated. The timepiece is relatively muted by contemporary Breitling standards, with a principally satin-finished case and that small flaring polished lug. The lugs themselves are fairly complex. There's the bevel, there's the tops, there's the side, and then there's a strong, geometrically defined sort of downward tuck or invert ducktail. It adds complexity to the case, and it's much appreciated. The case band forms a strong longitudinal presence in contrast with the polish of the case back. You can see that there's a little polished lip, as well as the polish of the bezel itself. Okay, the bezel. This is where people get into the point of blows on forums, because yes, it's a rotating bidirectional bezel, but it's a Navitimer without the slide rule. Historically, Breitling has made Navitimers that are neither circular slide rules nor chronographs. Heck, Breitling's even made a few Navitimers that aren't even mechanical watches. That said, I'm not sure any of those series have ever been as memorable as the slide rule watch, or the original, which essentially only one family can be, and that is the slide rule chronograph. So you line up that index with the minute hand. Now you can time things in a sort of general sense. You use it in a approximation exercise, as there are no actual calibrations on the bezel, though the action is highly refined, smooth, and exudes quality. Nevertheless, it's going to be a bit puzzling if you want to read it in anything more precise than maybe quarters, as reading to the minute essentially impossible unless you start the chronograph. That said, the dial is rich and appealing. Let me give us a bit more aperture so we have more light and get closer to the dial, focus in and try to show some of these details because they are worthy of discussion. First, the Sunburst is subtle and handsome. The radial grain nicely suits the brown bronze dial base that has more than a hint of color and nicely consonant with the rose gold of the hands, the numerals, the Breitling B, the index at 6, and the case itself. The tone-on-tone Q lets you know that this is a manufacture movement. The new design language at Breitling is going to be tone-on-tone dials when you have a manufacture movement. Monotone, that is, for instance, all blue, all black, when you have a customer caliber like a Valjoux 7750. You'll also note that there are separate scales, and chronograph hours and minutes are favored over the more generic form and calibration of constant seconds at 9 o'clock. There's a discrete date window, which I believe is optimally placed at 4:30. If you're going to have a date, don't let it eat into the indices. Don't let it eat into the balance of the dial. Don't necessarily let it eat into any of the sub-registers. Make it the kind of thing that's there when you want it and largely disappears when you don't. Now, in terms of the seconds hand, I find that's one of the most successful elements of the dial. The lacquered white tip makes reading it at a glance quite easy. And you'll note that the calibration of the scale outboard is inspired by 1930s Breitling aviation instruments, not necessarily watches, but also clocks and dashboard instruments for the flight deck of aircraft, as the 8 Aviation division of Breitling from this period inspires the Navitimer 8 nomenclature of this model line. Another element that's changed since the first variants of this dial is the addition of the name Navitimer on the dial and the acknowledgement of the movement's chronometer status. The prototype was a printed dial without applied indices and numerals, and it also featured just the name Breitling with the now wingless B logo. That is a change. The B has lost its wings as Breitling wants to emphasize its sporting inclinations, but across the water, the air, and the land, no longer simply an aviation watch. Vintage pump-style pushers and the crown without shoulders, but I should mention it is a screw-down crown, and the watch does boast impressive 100-meter water resistance, as you can easily read off the case back. Now, this is a numbered series, not a limited edition, but it is considered to be a special series by Breitling. Caliber B01, which has been around in one form or another since 2009, rarely seen, and in fact, it's a good-looking movement, hardly the industrial device you might have suspected. It's handsome with polished components, black polished screws, polished levers about the chronograph. You can see Côte de Genève, admittedly probably stamped across the bridges, but a nice touch. You'll also note that there is a dressage or graining radially arrayed across the different materials of the rotor. 70-hour power reserve, automatic winding, 28,800 vibrations per hour. Of course, you do have hacking or stop seconds, the COSC chronometer certification. There is a quick set function so you can rapidly cycle the date should the watch run down or encounter an irregular length month. And thanks to the vertical clutch architecture of the movement, you can simply leave the chronograph running. If you don't like to read small seconds, you can leave the chronograph running with no additional wear and tear. Moreover, thanks to the vertical clutch, there is absolutely no jump to the chronograph seconds hand when it starts. It doesn't have any inherent play between the teeth of wheels that a lateral clutch has. And it's also important to remember that now, just about a decade into B01 production, these are essentially as tough and as reliable as any ETA 2894 or Valjoux 7750, so you get the refinement of the in-house caliber without any compromise in durability. The column wheel ensures that as you cycle the functions, you really feel it and you hear it. This is one of the best feeling chronograph mechanisms this side of a Longa datograph. Yes, it's that impressive. You can see and you can purchase this Breitling Navitimer 8 solid gold with B01 caliber on our website. And we are back with the Breitling Navitimer 8 B01 Chronograph 43. As you can see, plenty of luminescence to read this one in the dark. You can see it by the light of day on the watch box.